Okay, so we are here with Ultimate Wolverine, the Winter Soldier, and this time he's facing off against Ultimate Sabretooth, and it's pretty dope. Now, before we get to Sabretooth, there is something that we have to discuss. Otherwise, this is going to be lost. So technically, we didn't cover issue number 4. There really wasn't enough to justify making a whole video. The big takeaway from the 4th issue is that when it comes to controlling Wolverine in this new Ultimate Universe, that Eurasia, basically the Soviet Union and a few different other countries, all led by like Colossus and those guys, who were villains, in this particular instance, that they have 3 measures of control. The first one is essentially computer chips in his brain, right, that allow them to control him to some degree. The second one is mental reconditioning, which is what most people are familiar with, right, adjusting his memories, different things like that. The third one is telepathic manipulation, which actually comes from Jean Grey. Now, we only saw her in the 4th issue strung up in some giant, orb or something like that, and so seemingly she's sedated and she's used for Eurasia's own ends. So it's not Jean as you traditionally know her. But that brings us into this comic. The reason being because Sabretooth is not the traditional villain that you're used to. Instead, he's essentially a member of the Mutant Underground Railroad. And in fact, he runs a bar right out in Rasputingrad, the Eurasian Republic, because again, Colossus, Peter Rasputin, is a villain and named the entire city after himself, which is kind of crazy. But what ends up happening is that after the regular people in the bar leave, that Sabretooth says, hey, you can come out now. And we're met by Artie and Leech. Now, despite what you may think, if you're familiar with the character of Leech, he is going to be important in the story. Artie is going to be way more important, probably in the future, of the Winter Soldier Ultimate Wolverine story. And it's really cool. I'll explain why here in a little while. But one of the things that Sabretooth tells them is that the driver will be here soon in order to pick them up and to basically get them out. And he says, I took the liberty of making you food. I recommend that you guys eat up. It'll be a long ride, no stops, not until you're across the border. But this should last you guys. Hearty soup, good for the soul, they say, but they also say a lot of things. Now, I don't necessarily know if I would eat anything that Sabretooth made for me, but hey, desperate times call for desperate measures. But there is a little bit of a kind of backstory here. We don't really get the full details, but Sabretooth basically talks about how there was an effort made to not just rescue them, but to rescue a few other people. Now, that is one of the important things to specify here in the Ultimate Wolverine comic. While you do have Ultimate X-Men from Peach Momoko, that doesn't really focus on the X-Men the way you would traditionally expect when it comes to this whole new Ultimate Universe line. What the other half of the story is telling us in the Ultimate Wolverine line is that, in effect, yes, mutants have existed in Eurasia, and they were basically rounded up and they were captured, they were executed, or they were forced into service for the Eurasian country itself. Now, this is actually borrowed directly from Marvel Comics in their main Marvel universe, and a lot of people don't know this, but there is a group called Siberia Force, or Cyber Force, as some people call it. The idea is that while the People's Protectorate, and even before that, right, the Soviet Supers, or Soviet Super Soldiers, I can't remember what their name was, while they were basically like the Avengers or precursors to the Avengers in the Soviet Union, Siberia Force was composed of mutants who had basically gone underground. They were rounded up by the Soviet government, and again, either they were executed or they were forced into service for the Soviet government. That's where Siberia Force came from. Now, eventually, Siberia Force and People's Protectorate merge, and that gives you the Winter Guard, which is definitively Russia's version of the Avengers. But again, it's one of these instances where Marvel is kind of pulling from their main Marvel universe throughout various stories that have been told over the years and rolling them into this particular story. So it's cool the way this whole thing works. And so in essence, mutants are being held in various camps around Eurasia, right, under the control of Peter Rasputin, his sister Magic, Omega Red, and a few other people. And we don't really know exactly what they're doing, potentially just either killing them or using them for their own ends. But again, there are efforts made to smuggle them out. And that's one of the things we learned about Wolverine. Nightcrawler and a few other people had been consistently trying to rescue him, and they were never successful in doing so. Then he's sent on a mission to kill them, and he successfully does. So again, there's this whole backstory that we haven't quite gotten yet for his character, and I'm excited to see what happens when we do. But one of the things that goes on is Sabretooth talks to Artie and Leech about the idea of telling them some old stories, right? Some old war stories, which always seem kind of exciting. And he's like, we'll finish that here in a second. Just let me take out the trash. Now, when he gets out there, he sees a plane flying overhead. And right off the bat, something seems amiss because he immediately comes running in. And one of the things that we learn that goes on here is that in an effort to find mutants that are either being smuggled out of the country, mutants that are operating underground, that are sneaking around, that kind of thing, that Eurasia runs these air reconnaissance missions where they literally use things like AWACS and satellites and whatnot in order to figure out what mutants are out there and to figure out ways to capture them if they cannot easily be dealt with by foot soldiers and things like that. And so when Sabretooth comes running back in, he literally tells them, like, you guys need to go back downstairs. I promise it's only going to be a temporary thing. We'll bring you guys back out. Now, there is a knock at the door, and when he opens the door, he gets outside. There's nobody there except for just some homeless guy wandering along the road talking about how they're closed. But then once he gets back inside the building, he finds Wolverine. Now, here's the cool thing here, right? Again, Sabretooth isn't really a villain the way that you're used to. And when he sees Wolverine's there and really smells the fact that he's there, he's like, so the rumors are true. You're back from the dead, but something's off. Right? Like something about you has changed. It smells almost rotten, that maybe you really are dead. But then he kind of muses and he's like, no, you're not really dead, but you're not yourself. And that's where Wolverine pops his claws and Sabretooth says, yeah, you're not yourself at all. Like, I know Logan and I know that he would not be so stupid as to try to take me on in a head-on fight. You're not him. You may look like him, but you're an empty vessel, right? Something with you is wrong. Now, this is so cool. It's one of the coolest elements because that is true. Very rarely would you see Sabretooth or Wolverine just jump into a headlong fight with one another. They would try to ambush the other, take the other person by surprise, different things like that. And that's why Sabretooth says butchers, right? They messed with your brain, didn't they? They took their little fingers and their tools and they poked and pulled just like they did. And before he can finish that sentence, Wolverine cuts his arm off. So, what it also looks like Marvel's doing here is borrowing from Enemy of the State. Now, Enemy of the State was a really cool story in the main Marvel Universe. There is a what-if version where Wolverine basically kills the Marvel Universe, but Enemy of the State was this story where Hydra and the Hand were working together. They were taking heroes and they were brainwashing them and turning them into agents of Hydra. And because the Hand can resurrect people from the dead, whenever they were killed, the Hand would just bring them back. That's specifically is what was going on with Wolverine. He captured Moon Knight and a few other people. It was a really cool story, but what it seems like here is, again, Eurasia is kidnapping mutants and basically brainwashing them and turning them to their side. Potentially, he's even talking about Jean Grey. But again, because he has a healing factor with his arm basically missing, his arm just regrows. And so what he says is like, I don't know why they have you in a mask, but I am going to rip it off and I am going to find out. And at that point, you jump to a flashback between Wolverine and Sabretooth, where Wolverine says, like, if they ever capture me, right? Now, initially, Sabretooth is like, no, that's never going to happen, right? You don't need to worry about that. But the response of Wolverine is, no. If it happens, right, like I'm being 100% serious here. If it happens, I don't want to become one of their puppets. So you have to promise me, if I'm taken, you will kill me. Now, here's the crazy thing about this. Again, context clues, right? They have this almost X branding on their shoulders, and it's not really the X-Men the way we're traditionally used to, but it is something akin to it. But the statement, I don't want to become one of their puppets, seemingly Eurasia has been doing this for quite some time. And that's why I say, man, this is so cool. And I'm so excited to find out what the backstory behind this whole thing is. But that's where Sabretooth says, man, that's a tall order coming from a guy with a healing factor that keeps death at arm's length. But the response of Wolverine, I know it, right? We both have it. But even still, I want you to promise me that you will find a way. Make it happen and make it permanent. Now, of course, as you can probably suspect, the Muramasa blade doesn't exist in the Ultimate Universe, right? The sword that can nullify Wolverine's healing factor due to a portion of his soul being put in it, and then in turn will kill Wolverine. That doesn't exist here, right? So they have to find some other way to do this. And that's why during this fight between Sabretooth and Wolverine, Wolverine kind of continues on with this bit of a monologue when they were having that conversation. And he says, we know what they make us do to the folks that we fought side by side with, died with. And he says, I'm not going to walk away from this fire until I know I have your word, that I've been fighting with you long enough. I know you're good for it. You're bonded to your word, and I want to know that you will do it. And the response of Sabretooth, okay, well, if you want, then it's a deal. I will do it. But we both know that's not going to happen. And that's why this fight between the two is a great throwback, and it's a knockdown drag out because it is intense. I mean, literally stabbing each other, slashing each other, tearing each other to bits. And so finally, Sabretooth manages to get his hands on the mask of Wolverine. And he literally says, if I'm going to kill you, I'm going to look into your face when I do it, and tears the mask off of his face. Now, this is where you end up finding out he basically looks like feral Wolverine, right? It's one of the coolest aspects of his character. So feral Wolverine was a version of Wolverine from the aftermath of the Fatal Attraction storyline. When Magneto ripped the adamantium out of its body, Wolverine just takes off into the woods. It's actually the first time you learn in Marvel Comics that he has bone claws, and they're not just a product of the adamantium bonding process. He also lost his nose. But literally, he becomes feral, and he looks almost exactly like this. And in fact, this version of Wolverine is effectively a feral Wolverine, right? Like any semblance of self-control, any semblance of identity is gone. He has been reprogrammed to be a killing machine. Nothing more, nothing less. He even seems to go so far as to bite the tongue of Sabretooth and like rip it out of his mouth, right through his throat. It's kind of crazy. But in the midst of all of that, when Sabretooth hits the ground, while his healing factor starts to kick in, the door busts open. And initially, we don't know who it is that shows up here, but then she brandishes these darts that come firing out of her wrist. It's Black Widow. It's the Ultimate Universe version of Black Widow. And I never thought we would actually see her character, but it's amazing because at that point she starts firing all these darts on Wolverine, and it's enough to knock him out. And at that point she opens the trap door where the kids are, and she was like, so here's your ride. I'm the person that's supposed to be giving you a ride. And the response to Sabretooth is, well, this doesn't make any sense, right? Like, I mean, I don't get it. Why is he out like that, right? His healing factor is not kicking in. And Leech just stands up and is like, that's me. And that's one of the best things about his character. Now, of course, when I initially told you guys that Leech was in this comic, those of you guys who know his character know right off the bat, okay, so obviously this is how they're going to defeat Ultimate Wolverine, even if only in the interim. Of course, as some of you guys may not know, Leech has the ability to nullify the powers of other people, up to and including reality warpers, right? We saw him nullify the powers of Absalom Mercator, a guy who can manipulate matter on the atomic and subatomic level. And so the other person here is Artie. And the reason why I say Artie is so important here is because Artie has what is in effect telepathic projection. So quite literally, he can take the thoughts of other people and project them in the form of essentially holograms for the world to see. He is an invaluable resource here because he can enter into the mind of Wolverine and show everyone how Wolverine sees the world. With that kind of tool at their disposal, they can better understand his brainwashing and potentially even overcome it. Not only that, because of all the things that Wolverine's seen, right? Everything that he's witnessed. Of course, they'll see the various members of the X-Men that he's killed, but they'll also get the inner workings, the role of Colossus and all that kind of stuff. It's cool, right? There's so many opportunities here. In effect, Wolverine has just become the only real way for Sabretooth and the Mutant Underground to take out the ruling class in Eurasia. And that's why Sabretooth says, you guys aren't going anywhere alone. I'm 100% going with you. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Again, dude, this story is so incredibly amazing. I absolutely love it. I can't wait to see where this goes. But thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.